around, and a lot of different concepts that need to be paid attention to. So we're going to try to decode those acronyms and define those concepts. And to that end, we have a bunch of different topics under acronyms that we've organized by various categories, such as stakeholder groups, systems, which is related to the information systems that contain fleet information, the data that resides within those systems, the analysis that is conducted using that data, reporting. There's various venues for reporting fleet information. We're going to talk about sustainability and also some miscellaneous terms that really didn't quite fit in one category very neatly. And we're going to talk about terms once we move on from acronyms. And there are a lot of terms related to asset management and, again, more miscellaneous terms. And a lot of these concepts, these acronyms and terms are used in conjunction with or in furtherance of complying with federal laws that pertain to fleet management. We're going to talk about regulations, bulletins, and provide an example. And then one last bullet point, we have a win a free ... You'll have to wait until the end of the presentation to find out what that's all about. So let's first talk about stakeholder groups. We have a lot of different organizations, both governmental, private sector, at the federal, and also nonprofit organizations that are involved in fleet management. So we have the Alternative Fuel Data Center, which is a website that provides a lot of useful information and tools related to petroleum consumption reduction and the implementation of alternative fuels. We have the American Petroleum Institute. They actually are an advocate for the petroleum industry, as well as a certifying body for the types of engine oils that are used in fleet maintenance. We have APWA, which is a professional organization, the American Public Works Association. Then we have a part of the Department of Transportation, which is the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, BTS. Now, the next two relate to California specifically, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, and the California Energy Commission, CEC. Those two organizations are important because there are a lot of emissions requirements that are specific to California vehicles, and in recent years, a lot of other states have adopted those more stringent emissions requirements, and you may have vehicles in your fleet that are subject to those rules rather than the more generic EPA federal rules. CSO is a term that's become more popular here, with the chief sustainability officers having a more predominant role in managing the emissions or the environmental impacts of the organization's operations. DOE is the U.S. Department of Energy. EERE is the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And EIA, Energy Information Administration. Now, that agency provides forecasts on fuel pricing out into the long term. I think they forecast out to at least 2025 what the energy price outlook is going to be, as well as providing statistics on energy consumption in various sectors, in transportation, in building use, in power generation. Then we have the EPA, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. FEMP is the Federal Energy Management Program. They provide guidance on management of federal vehicles, as well as providing, they have a role in the Fleet Dash reporting tool, which some of you are probably familiar with, where opportunities or missed opportunities to utilize alternative fuels can be found for your organization based on fueling data that they acquire. General Motors is GM. Now we have another professional organization called NAFTA, that's the National Association of Fleet Administrators. They're a large professional organization that has a lot of representation within corporate fleets as well as public sector fleets. We have the National Property Management Association, which has a large role in the federal sector dealing with personal property, as well as a now expanding role in the fleet property area. We have OEMs, our original equipment manufacturers, and here's a governmental organization. OGP is the Office of Government-Wide Policy, which is within the General Services Administration. So moving on to the information systems that are used in fleet. So we have FMIS, which is a type of software that is a fleet management information system. It's a system that's designed specifically to acquire or aggregate all of the information that is required to make good, sound fleet business decisions. And fleet management information systems contrast with property systems in that fleet systems are more towards the large amount of operational data that is incorporated into fleet management, such as mileage and fuel transactions, maintenance and repair costs, and things of that nature. Now, an example of an FMIS is FMS. That's the GSA's Federal Fleet Management System, and that is also an IFMS, which is an interagency fleet management system. So this system is available for owned fleets within the federal sector to use in the management of their fleet. And then moving on, we have FMVRS, which is the Federal Motor Vehicle Registration System, which is the data warehouse for all the motor vehicle records, or MVRs, for the federal government, and that can be accessed by law enforcement agencies around the country when they have to run a plate for a federal vehicle to find out who the owner is. So the next thing we're going to talk about is fleet data. And within Fleet Management Information System, an FMIS, there's a lot of data that is categorized. And one of the reasons why we create all these categories for data is so that we can break the fleet apart into pieces to be able to evaluate the operational or life cycle cost information for various segments of the fleet, rather than trying to make sense of the fleet as a whole. So gross vehicle weight rating, GVWR, is the capacity of a vehicle to carry a load. Every vehicle out there that's designed for on-highway use has a gross vehicle weight rating. Model year, MY, is an important piece of information, as well as vehicle identification number, or VIN. That's a 17-digit code that describes the place of manufacture, the manufacturer, the chassis information, engine information, year of manufacture, as well as a unique identifier for every vehicle that's out there. LDV is light duty vehicle. Now, LE1, LE2, and LE3 are various classifications for law enforcement vehicles that describe the type of function that vehicle fulfills, whether it be a patrol vehicle with lights and sirens, or on the other end of the spectrum, an LE3 is an administrative vehicle that's used by a law enforcement agency, but not necessarily for law enforcement specific purposes. It may be a more administrative vehicle or used for investigation, things where an emergency response is not necessary. Of course, SUV is a sport utility vehicle. And then we have MSA and CMSA. That's a metropolitan statistical area and a combined metropolitan statistical area. And the reason that this information is important is it provides, it's a category that's used to determine whether vehicles are exempt or non-exempt from certain EPACT requirements. So for vehicles that are in a metropolitan or combined metropolitan statistical area, there may be more or higher level requirements for vehicles to use alternative fuels, because the assumption is that there are probably more alternative fuel stations located in those areas rather than rural areas. HTW is home to work. This is the ability or the authorization to take vehicles from the place of work to the employee's home, and requires justification in most organizations, if not all organizations, or should. And then we have M&R, which is maintenance and repair. And those are the costs associated with maintaining and repairing vehicles to keep them in good working order and to preserve their value. We're going to talk about analysis. So we've talked about the systems that gather the data. We've talked about the data itself that can be gathered, and then all of that data gathering is supposed to lead to something, and this is where analysis is used to turn data into information for making decisions about your fleet program. So types of analysis that are done on fleets are LCA, which is a life cycle cost analysis, where the capital costs of the vehicle are weighed against the operational costs of the vehicle to determine what the appropriate term of ownership of those vehicle or replacement cycle is. So that drives your overall replacement spending depending upon how long your vehicles are being kept in service before they're being replaced. Now, one area in the federal fleet specifically that's mentioned in a regulation is a vehicle allocation methodology. And what that really means is fleet right sizing and right typing. So do you have the right size of fleet? Do you have the appropriate number of vehicles for the mission at hand? And do you have the right types of vehicles for the mission at hand? And an example would be if you have employees that are driving around in pickup trucks when their job functions really would allow them to drive a compact sedan, there would be a mismatch between the vehicle that's provided to the employee and the appropriate vehicle in terms of minimizing the total cost of ownership. Now, another type of analysis that can be used is called a vehicle equivalent unit analysis, which is essentially a way of forecasting what the maintenance requirements are of the organization or personnel requirements. So say you take your full-size sedans, and the level of effort that's required to maintain a full-size sedan for a year is called 1 BEU. So say that's approximately $1,200. What you would then do is normalize all of the other vehicle classes in the fleet to that standard, so that an SUV might be 1.2 BEUs because it costs slightly higher to maintain. And in that way, you can come up with a comparability measure that can be used to compare different fleets and try to make some sense of what the appropriate staffing levels are for your fleet, things of that nature. So then we've got this analysis, and like I said, comparability is one of the aspects of a BEU study. All of this data is difficult to determine what the appropriate level is unless you normalize the results. So, if you want to talk about emissions, you want to talk about emissions in terms of vehicle miles traveled. If you want to talk about costs, you want to talk about cost per mile. Because mileage might go up and down over time, or and that might skew your results if you're trying to benchmark your analysis from year to year. Now we move into fleet acronyms that are related to reporting, and there are various reports that are required of federal fleet managers, and one of the areas in which fleet data is reported is through the Federal Automotive Statistical tool, or FAST. And typically that's end of fiscal year data is analyzed by an agency to make sure it's accurate, the data is scrubbed, and then it's uploaded to the Federal Automotive Statistical tool, which is run by GSA. And I think they're in partnership with another organization. And we have Fleet Attainment Plan, which is a FAP. That's a plan of how the agency is going to achieve its optimal fleet inventory. And then we have the FMP, which is a Fleet Management Plan, which is a narrative plan that describes the organization's efforts to manage its fleet size. It describes the organization's efforts to forecast budget requirements for upcoming fiscal years, and describe various other aspects of the fleet operation. So one of the big areas in federal fleet that's been gaining increased visibility in the last, say, 10 or 15 years has been the area of sustainability. So we've got a lot of acronyms and terms that are geared directly towards that topic. We have alternative fuel vehicles, or AFVs, and then underneath that we have various types of alternative fuel vehicles. One that you might hear is B20, or biodiesel. That's a 20% biodiesel and 80% petrodiesel mix. And I would add that most diesel vehicles, depending upon the manufacturer's certification, can run on biodiesel at some blend level, either B5 at 5% or B20 at obviously 20%. And we have E85, which is 85% ethanol, 15% gasoline, and that runs in FFVs, which are flex fuel vehicles. Moving on, we have LPG, which is liquefied petroleum gas, a slightly less popular option in the United States, but actually very popular worldwide. I think there are more than 17 million LPG vehicles around the world, a lot of prevalence in Asia and South America. And LPG actually runs on propane or autogas, the same type of fuel that you would that would be burning through your gas grill outside your house. Although it's in, obviously bottles, it's stored differently on those vehicles for transportation safety purposes. We have low-speed electric vehicles, LSEVs, NGVs, or natural gas vehicles, and they come in two types. One is CNG, or compressed natural gas, which is a very capital-intensive fuel in terms of buying a compressor station to run CNG or gaining access to a compressor station. And actually not on here, we have LNG, which is not very popular other than in the heavy truck market or transit bus market, and that would be LNG. So other ways of approaching sustainability rather than going with alternative fuels, we have increasing miles per gallon, MPG. And one of the ways of evaluating alternative fuels is to look at it in terms of gasoline gallon equivalent. Because not all fuels have the same energy content per unit. Therefore, in order to compare from one to another, you have to compensate for the fact that some fuels may have less ability to move you down the road per gallon. Now, the aim of one of the primary aims of all this talk about sustainability is to reduce greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gas emissions, obviously there's a lot of talk of global warming. There's been a recent executive order that is aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, both from vehicle sources as well as non-vehicle sources like federal buildings and things like that. Another emission that we have to be worried about is carbon monoxide, which is different from carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is more commonly the greenhouse gas component of exhaust. Carbon monoxide is less prevalent, but also is a colorless, odorless gas that is emitted from the vehicles. We have NMHC, non-methane hydrocarbons, and then we have various other pollutants, NOx, SOx, SPOX, and PM, which are nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, volatile organic compounds, and particulate matter. And we have other fleet acronyms. OBD is onboard diagnostics. Now, onboard diagnostics came about for a variety of reasons, but one was as an emissions control process. After 1996, I believe all new vehicles manufactured in the United States had to have a standardized OBD2 port, and that's a 17-pin connector that's underneath the dash. And that's used for engine diagnostic purposes. It's also used for emissions compliance. A lot of states don't require a vehicle to run on the rolling road test, the dynamometer. Rather, they just plug into the onboard diagnostic port to see if there are any engine problems with the vehicles, and that suffices for passing an emissions test. And we have another acronym, PM. This refers to preventive maintenance. Those are the activities that you carry out on vehicles to make sure that they're safe and that you preserve the asset's value over the life of the vehicle. Then we have POVs, personally owned vehicles or privately owned vehicles, as opposed to GOVs or government-owned vehicles. And next we have standard operating procedures. So these are the expectations that are codified in writing, that are distributed to an organization about how they use the fleet, how you gather and collect fleet information, how you justify replacement spending. There's a variety of venues for developing SOPs within the fleet arena. Now we're going to move on from the acronyms into the asset management terms. So one way of remarketing vehicles is through an auction, and these can be either physical or online auctions. One of the most common places where we see auctions is the GSA remarketing vehicles, but in other sectors there are online auction websites such as Public Surplus or GovDeals, or I'm not advocating for any one in particular, but those are just the ones that come to mind. I mentioned benchmarking or comparing fleet performance and cost, and that can be done either internally over time or within various fleet segments, or it can be done externally against other agencies that have similar fleets, both in terms of mission and composition. Now, capital costs, we have gross capital costs, which is your spending on fleet every year to buy new vehicles. And that differs from net capital costs in that gross capital costs doesn't take into account the revenues from the sale of your used vehicles, whereas net capital cost does. So net includes your exchange sale proceeds or your remarketing proceeds. And we have depreciation. There are two types of depreciation in the fleet arena. Market depreciation is the change in fair market value of the vehicle over its life. So if you buy a vehicle brand new and it's $20,000 and you get rid of it after 5 years and it's $10,000, and you have a $10,000 change in fair market value. Now we have book depreciation, which is different from market depreciation in that book depreciation usually is an accounting term that describes an amortized amount of depreciation every month, or straight line depreciation where it doesn't vary. Now we all know that depreciation from a market standpoint is more heavily loaded in the first year, and in fact when you first drive the vehicle off the lot, you lose the most amount of resale value in the vehicle, whereas book depreciation is a constant line. Fleet creep and overfleeting are two terms that are related. Fleet creep is where the fleet tends to slowly increase in size, and this can be for a variety of reasons. One is that there's a lack of validating requirements when sourcing new vehicles or buying new vehicles for various programs. And another is new vehicles are placed into service, and there isn't the loop isn't closed on the old vehicles to make sure that they're turned in and decommissioned and resold for resale proceeds. And then overfleeting is the term that describes what happens when you have too many vehicles in the fleet, or vehicles that are much larger than is actually needed in the fleet. We talk about replacement cycles and life cycle costs. We talked about life cycle analysis, LCA, before. So doing a life cycle analysis is essentially looking at the capital cost and operating cost to determine what the appropriate term of ownership is, and you should use that to determine your replacement cycles for the key classes of vehicles in your fleet. Now, direct and indirect costs are related in that direct costs are costs in your fleet that you can assign to a particular vehicle. So you know that the oil was changed in vehicle 1, 2, 3 and it costs $50. That's a direct cost that you can tie directly back to that vehicle. Now, indirect costs would be, say, the cost of purchasing a fleet management information system, where that cost is spread out over all of the units of the fleet and can't be tied to one particular asset. Then we have fixed costs and variable costs. And fixed costs are those costs that that do not change over time. Obviously, one fixed cost would be insurance. Another would be, say, a GSA lease payment for the lease part of the vehicle. And a variable cost would be one that changes over time, such as maintenance or the mileage charge that you incur for using an ESA vehicle. And then we have more miscellaneous terms. We have vehicle utilization, which is a key part of analyzing the size and composition of the fleet and right sizing or accomplishing a vehicle allocation methodology. So vehicle utilization is an analysis of, or it describes the amount of mileage or trips or hours of use of a vehicle. And the most common utilization measure is mileage. However, you know, if you have, say, a plumbing van that drives out to a facility, goes 2 miles in the morning to the facility, works all day at the facility, and back 2 miles, well, you might only accrue 4 miles that day, and the utilization would look quite low if you looked only at the mileage at the end of the year. But if you looked at the hours of use, that vehicle is being used full time. So you can't only look at mileage when you come up with a utilization criteria. And we have Log World, which is a multiple award schedule, and that's transitioning towards the professional services schedule in the future. Motor pool is a collection of vehicles for shared use, and you have intra and interagency motor pools. So commonly, agencies will have an intra-agency motor pool where all of the costs for the vehicle are borne by a single entity, and that vehicle is therefore not available for use by other agencies. With new technology, there are interagency motor pools coming out, which are similar to like a Zipcar program where the costs can be allocated. The technology exists that can allocate the cost to the appropriate program or office, and that enables the use of interagency motor pools. And that's also one way of reducing your fleet size, because you can consolidate some mini motor pools down into smaller consolidated motor pools and avoid owning an excessive amount of vehicles. And we can look at vehicle downtime and availability, which are the inverse of one another. So vehicle availability might be 95%, vehicle downtime might be 5%. If you have a fleet management information system, it should capture the start time of a work order and the end time of a work order, and from that you can infer how many hours vehicles are actually available. Now, if you can select vendors that perform repairs more quickly, or if you insource your maintenance and have your own in-house repair technicians that can turn around repairs more quickly, you can use that to improve your vehicle availability and reduce your vehicle downtime. So that's one of the reasons why organizations may elect to insource their maintenance, is to manage that downtime part. And we have work orders, which are a record of labor parts and sublets for an asset, and that's usually done for each repair event. So when a vehicle is dropped off for maintenance, one work order is created, all the repairs are performed, and the vehicle is inspected, and then it's put back in service, and then you would have no open work orders until the next time the vehicle is in for maintenance. We have the term yellow fleet, which is used to describe heavy trucks and off-road and construction equipment. A lot of off-road and construction equipment is not fast or portable, yet agencies can have a significant amount of investment in those vehicles, as well as a significant amount of fuel consumption in those vehicles. So that's something to keep in mind. A lot of the same principles that apply to the management of on-road or fast reportable vehicles also can be applied to the yellow fleet. We have 701 waiver, which is a request to use non-alternative fuel in a dual or flex fuel vehicle, and that more information can be found in EPAC 2005. And then we have biofuels, which you mentioned before, which are predominantly ethanol and biodiesel. And those are fuels derived from modern organic sources. And I use the term modern because most fuels, petroleum fuels, are actually derived from organic sources, but they're from fossilized sources or sources from millions of years ago. So when we talk about biofuels, we're typically talking about those that are sourced from soybeans or animal fats or grease or whatever, or corn in the case of ethanol. And then we have home to work and personal use. Home to work was covered in acronyms, and then personal use would be typically is not authorized. I can't think of many instances where it is at all, and that would be something to look for in your fleet to ensure that employees aren't using their vehicles in an unauthorized manner. And that can, with the advent of telematics, that could be an opportunity to ensure that vehicles aren't being used for personal use. The federal fleet management basis in law. So we've got a lot of laws and regulations that apply to fleet management. So we're going to go through the source of some of those laws and talk about the difference between the regulations, the bulletins, and the statutes. So statutory law and administrative law provide the foundation for federal fleet management. And statutory law are typically those that are passed by Congress, and they're in the United States Code. And then administrative law is either federal, department, or agency regulations. Executive orders can fall under this, which implement or apply the statutory law. They are both legally binding, and the President has the authority to issue executive orders. Now, GSA has promulgated a lot of bulletins, and they've been given the authority to do that by an act of Congress. So the Federal Property and Administrative Services Act of 1949, as amended, gives GSA the authority to establish motor pools and issue federal management regulations, or FMR. So here are some statutes. The Energy Policy Act of 2005 established a number of energy management goals for federal facilities and fleets. The ISA 2007 is the Energy Independence and Security Act, and that was aimed towards energy reduction goals for federal buildings. It incorporated some language about OMB reporting, Office of Management and Budget reporting, and actually reducing petroleum consumption and increasing all fuel use. So the CAFE standards were increased through that piece of legislation, so they were trying to reduce petroleum consumption. And I don't know that we had CAFE in there. CAFE is the corporate average fuel economy standard, and that's a measure for each manufacturer of vehicles of the weighted average of fuel economy that their vehicles have to achieve. And those numbers have been getting more and more stringent over the last 20 years, and there are actually CAFE standards out to, I believe, 2025 at this point, requiring pretty significant increases in fuel economy. We have EO 13513, that's an executive order that bans texting while driving in government vehicles or with government-provided cell phones. And then EO 13693, which was mentioned before, that was issued in March of 2015, and it's called Planning for Federal Sustainability in the Next Decade. And in that, it basically incorporated and updated a lot of language, some preceding EOs, namely 13423, 13514, and also updated requirements of a presidential memorandum that was issued in May 24th, 2011, which I think was called Federal Fleet Performance. Now, important fleet management bulletins. As I said, GSA has been given the authority by Congress to issue federal management regulations which provide guidance on the usage of federal fleets. And there are various ones out there. The first one we'll talk about is B11, which talks about U.S. government license plate codes. B15, we talked about fleet management information systems. So B15 outlines requirements for management information systems in federal vehicle fleets. So there's some minimum standards as to the types of information that you should be collecting in order to call your FMIS B15 compliant. There's the FMR Bulletin B29, where it talks about accurately reporting passenger vehicle inventory through FAST. That's the Federal Automotive Statistical Tool. And B30, we've talked about vehicle allocation methodology for agency fleets. That's the right sizing and right typing. B31, government motor vehicle fueling during market shortages. And then we have B32, which is posting executive fleet vehicles on agency websites. And alternative fuel vehicle guidance for law enforcement and emergency vehicle fleets is a B33. Remember, we talked about law enforcement 1, law enforcement 2, and law enforcement 3 categories. That guidance was issued as part of B33. B35 talks about home-to-work transportation. B38 talks about the indirect costs of motor vehicle fleet operations. And there's a URL at the bottom of the slide in case you want to go read through those FMRs to become more familiar with them, because they definitely are very relevant if you have fleet responsibilities in the federal sector. Now here's an example of a regulation regarding fleet right sizing and typing. So section 102-34.50 of the U.S. Code basically states or asks the question of what size motor vehicles may we obtain, and prescribes that except for exempted vehicles, executive agencies shall acquire vehicles that achieve the maximum fuel efficiency, meet minimum body size and engine specifications, and possess the minimum optional equipment needed, and are mid-size, which is class 3 or smaller sedans, except when larger class 4 sedans are essential to the agency's mission. Now, that was a law that was that's a statutory law, and then when we go and look at, okay, what type of guidance is needed in order to achieve those objectives, we see the GSA has provided the B30 bulletin, which provides that guidance on achieving the correct fleet size and composition. So there is some degree of redundancy in the way in which the laws are constructed, but I would say that the general requirement is stated in the code, and the more specific information about how agencies should go about meeting or exceeding those requirements is listed in the FMRs or the bulletins. So here's another one talking about FMIS data requirements. We have section 102.30-34.340. Do we need a fleet management information system? Yes, you must have an FMIS at the department or agency level that identifies and collects accurate inventory, cost, and use data that covers the complete life cycle of each motor vehicle. And we talk about the 4 phases of a vehicle's life cycle being the acquisition phase, the operation and maintenance phase, and the disposal. And as I mentioned earlier, the thing about FMIS is that they are geared towards managing that large volume of operation and maintenance information that comes in, more so than just focusing on acquisition and disposal. Then that also provides the information necessary to satisfy both internal and external reporting requirements, including cost per mile, fuel costs for each motor vehicle, and FAST required data elements. And then we go and see that there's a GSA FMR Bulletin B15 that provides the requirements for management information systems, and it provides agencies with guidance on minimum FMIS functionality. So I think that concludes my part of the presentation. If anybody has any questions, please make sure you get them entered in on the dashboard there, and I will turn it back over to Jessica for the next slide.
Great, thank you, Scott. So just in closing, before we go today, I want to let everyone know about a little contest that we have going on throughout the month of January in celebration of Fleet Management Awareness Month. NPMA does have a special interest group program, which is free to both members and non-members to participate in. We have a number of groups that you can have access to where you have opportunities to network and ask questions from your peers or share knowledge with your peers and a subject that you all have kind of a similar interest in. One of the special interest groups that we do offer is the Fleet Management Special Interest Group. So if anyone is interested in joining, if you join in January, you will get entered into a drawing to win the free NPMA webinar. So it's a great opportunity to win it. Maybe you'll win something free, and you'll also have this great opportunity to connect with other people that have interest in fleet. But just kind of a quick way to get there, if you go to npma.org, you can look for a special interest groups box kind of front and center on our homepage, or if you go from our groups tab, you can go down to SIGs and the Fleet SIG, and you can join that way. So lots of great opportunities there. There's online discussion forums where you can really interact with other people that have a similar interest to you. And also these groups do meet in person at least once a year during our National Education Seminar each summer. So you'll have an opportunity to network with these individuals in person as well. So please take a chance to go out there and look and join the SIG and maybe some others if there are others that you are interested in. I believe we have about 13 to choose from, so lots of great opportunities there. I think we have one question. Let me just double check that really quick. Oh, it went away, so we are good. So you can take a look on the screen now, and you will see the contact information for both NPMA and Scott at Mercury Associates if you have any follow-up questions after this webinar. And as a reminder, a survey will pop up as soon as you close this down, and I will send everyone a follow-up email this afternoon with a copy of the recording and the slides and any other great information like how to get to the special interest groups. So I really do appreciate all of you for joining us today. And we do have one question. So Scott, I'm going to kind of go back to this. Okay, so Scott, the question is, are there any special regulations for international fleets?
Well, I would say yes, there are. Is this well, if it's for the federal sector, there is a distinction drawn between domestic and overseas vehicles in the way that information is reported. That's first. And then second, there are additional requirements that are placed on domestic vehicles that may not be necessarily placed on overseas vehicles. So when you start talking about mostly in the area of alternative fuel, that there are some waivers that are associated, or reporting is not required on a lot of the vehicles that are actually outside the United States. So I hope that answers the question. I don't know that there are necessarily international regulations that govern vehicles further than that, other than to talk about there are some Euro emission standards that are similar to our EPA standards, but I don't know that they necessarily apply to vehicles in the federal fleet.
Thank you, Scott. We do have another question.
I'm sure they apply, but at least not to the level that a fleet manager would have to be concerned about on a day-to-day basis.
I think that did answer the question that came in. And then the next question that we have is there a LoJack tracking for lost or stolen vehicles?
Well, the LoJack is a device that someone would have to have to pay to have installed in the vehicle in order to be able to track that. So it's not something that comes with every vehicle. Now there are similar types of things with telematics, that if a vehicle is stolen and you have telematics in the vehicle, then you can obviously locate the vehicle through that, assuming that the telematics device isn't removed by whoever stole the vehicle.
Very good. Thank you. All right, I do not see any other questions in the queue here or hands raised, so I think we are okay to wrap this up. But again, if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to email us for the contact information you see on our screen following the presentation. And thank you all for joining us today, and have a wonderful afternoon.